right there on the church steps. Nia dropped to her knees in her cream Sunday dress, not to pray, but to scrub mud off her husband's mistress's heels with her bare hands. The congregation watched in a silence that smelled like cowardice. Her husband called her worthless. His mother said she deserved the dirt. The mistress told her to get lower, because sorrow should look like a servant. But as Nia gripped the gold medallion hidden under her collar, a line of black Rolls-Royces silenced the street. The doors opened slowly, and the air around that church turned cold. A man with an empire in his eyes stepped out, a trillionaire who had been burning worlds for 26 years to find his only heir. The bells thought they were breaking a nobody. They didn't realize they were declaring war on a god. Hello friends, welcome to Black Bite Stories. Before we begin today's story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our global family. The bells kept ringing while people slowed down to stare. Women in pressed hats whispered behind satin gloves. Men in dark suits looked away just long enough to protect their own comfort, and Reverend Deborah King froze in the doorway with her Bible against her chest and shame already moving behind her eyes. Simone read the woman on Darius's arm, extended her foot like a queen offering insults as tribute, and told Nia to get lower because a proper apology should look like sorrow. Nia lowered her head, but not her soul. And when her small gold medallion slipped from her collar and flashed in the sunlight, she closed her fingers around it like she was holding on to the last honest thing she owned. Nia had been taught early that black women survive by carrying what other people drop on them. She learned it from her grandmother Ruth in a weathered house outside Savannah, where rain leaked through the porch roof, and respectability never paid the light bill. Ruth used to say the world would call a black girl strong when what it really meant was unattended, overworked, and expected to heal in silence. So Nia grew up soft-spoken but watchful, the kind of child who read library books twice, washed dishes without being asked, and learned that dignity was often the only inheritance a poor black family could protect. She never knew her father. Ruth told her only that her mother died young and that the man who helped create her belonged to a storm bigger than either of them. Whenever Nia asked more, Ruth would fasten the gold medallion around her neck and say, "Your name was fought over before you could speak, baby, so keep this close until the truth learns how to find you." Inside the medallion was half of a strange crest and the faded photos of a smiling black man holding a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket. Nia used to stare at that picture at night and wonder how love could look so certain in a face that never came back. When Ruth got sick, Nia buried her own dreams to keep the house breathing. She gave up a nursing scholarship, worked mornings at a laundry, evenings at a diner, and nights doing braids in a cramped Atlanta apartment after she sold Ruth's land for less than it was worth. The city called itself opportunity, but for poor black women, it often meant smiling through low wages, late buses, landlords who ignored broken heat, and managers who praised endurance as if endurance were a raise. Nia still carried herself with grace, but grace gets expensive when everybody around you wants it for free. She met Darius when he came into the diner talking polished and laughing loud enough to sound safe. He was handsome, church-bred, college-educated, and fluent in the kind of tenderness that can mimic rescue long enough to become a trap. He tipped well, prayed before meals, called her brilliant for remembering his order, and said a woman like her deserved a home where she did not have to fight for every dollar and every breath. Nia had spent so much of life surviving that the idea of being chosen felt holy. For the first year, he played husband like a man rehearsing his own legend. He bought flowers on payday, quoted scripture over dinner, and told people God had sent him a wife with substance instead of vanity. But Celeste never looked at Nia like a daughter. She looked at her like a stain on the family image. At church luncheons, she would introduce Darius as her pride and Naya as the girl he took in, a phrase sweet enough to pass in public and cruel enough to rot in private. The cruelty deepened by inches, not blows. Darius said nursing school could wait because a good wife should not be distracted. Then he asked for access to her savings because marriage meant unity. Then he laughed when she questioned why more and more money vanished into ventures she never saw. Celeste inspected the house like a prison matron and reminded Nia that poor black women should be grateful when status opens a door, even if that door only leads to a prettier cage. By the time Simon appeared in tailor dresses and expensive perfume, Nea had already been reduced from partner to servant inside her own marriage. Simone came through Celas's women's ministry circle, all polished ambition and smiling contempt. She talked about branding, luxury events, and elevation. Words Celeste adored because they made greed sound visionary. Darius began staying out late with her, taking calls in front of Nia, chuckling at private jokes, while his wife stood over boiling pots and unpaid bills. The affair did not hide because it did not need to. Men, like Darius, survive on the confidence that the world will punish the woman they humiliate before it ever questions the man humiliating her. 2 weeks before the church scene, Nia found out why Darius had been so desperate for her signature. He had emptied nearly every dollar from their joint savings to help Simon launch an event company, using money Nia earned over years of split shifts and skipped meals. When she confronted him, he told her she should thank him for giving her access to a lifestyle she could never build alone. And Celeste said black women from nothing often confuse survival money with ownership. That night, Nia moved into the guest room with one suitcase, Ruth's Bible, and the medallion pressed so hard into her palm it left a mark. Then Celeste announced a public covenant celebration at church. It would not be a wedding, she said, just a blessing for the future God was clearly ordaining between Darius and Simon, because some unions die before papers catch up to the funeral. New Promise was drowning in debt, and the Bell family had paid enough tithes to buy silence from people who preached righteousness on Sundays and feared losing chandeliers on Mondays. Reverend Deborah knew the event was wrong, but she also knew the building fund depended on Celeste's circle, and cowardice often dresses itself as stewardship before it sits down in a church pew. That Sunday morning, Nia almost stayed home, but some ache dragged her there. Maybe grief, maybe fury, maybe the last stubborn piece of herself, refusing to let strangers rewrite the story of her life without at least looking them in the face. She stood near the church door with her old Bible and watched Darius climb the steps with Simon on his arm and Celeste floating beside them like a woman arriving at her own coronation. When Darius stopped in front of her and told her she would not enter with them, the crowd shifted closer, hungry for a spectacle they could later rename concern. Then Simon glanced down, saw a smear of mud on her heel, and smiled like temptation getting an idea. Darius turned to Nia and told her to kneel and make herself useful, because if she wanted to remain in his house until the divorce was filed, she had better learn humility. Celeste added that too many black wives confuse patience with position, and the church ought to witness this lesson before service began. Nia set her Bible down, dropped to her knees on the cold stone, and let the humiliation move over her like rain, because sometimes surviving a public cruelty requires first outlasting it. She had just dragged the mud away with her bare hand when a little boy near the rails began to choke. Jeremiah, Reverend Deborah's 8-year-old grandson, had stuffed peppermints into his mouth while adults watched drama instead of children, and now his eyes bulged as panic ripped through the crowd. Hats turned. Voices rose. Nobody moved fast enough. Nia was already on her feet. She forgot the dirt on her palms and the tears on her face. She knelt beside the boy, spoke to him low and steady, tilted his body, struck between his shoulder blades, and when the candy still would not move, she used the rescue technique she learned in the nursing program she had once been forced to leave. The peppermint shot free. Jeremiah coughed, and the full breath tore back into his chest like life re-entering a room. Reverend Deborah sank beside them, shaking, and for one long second the entire church forgot to breathe because the woman they had just watched degrade had risen first to save a child. None of them protected. Deborah looked at Nia as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Darius reached for authority again, muttering that everybody should calm down, but the sound no longer fit him. A few people stepped back from him. A few more stared at Nia's scraped hands and lowered eyes and seemed to realize that they had mistaken silence for emptiness, when silence had actually been discipline. Then a line of black vehicles rolled to the curb so smoothly the whole street quieted around them. The last one, a long black Rolls-Royce, stopped directly in front of the church steps, and from it stepped an older black man in a charcoal coat with silver at his temples and grief carved deep enough into his face to make power look tired. Beside him came Solomon Briggs, a broad-shouldered man with the posture of someone trusted to carry secrets correctly. Solomon looked at Thea once, saw the medallion in her hand, and everything in his expression changed. He climbed the steps slowly, as if he understood he was walking into the center of a wound. When he reached her, he opened his palm to reveal the matching half of the crest on a chain almost identical to hers, and Nia's body went still in that sharp, impossible way truth can make a person feel struck and weightless at the same time. Solomon said her full name, not Nia Bell, but Nia Amara St. Clair, and the older man behind him broke on the sound of it. Miss St. Clair, Solomon said gently, this is your father. The church gasped, but Nia did not. She just stared at the man before her, as if her whole life had become a locked room, and somebody had finally found the key. Omari St. Clair, founder of a global empire in shipping, energy grids, and private infrastructure, had spent 26 years searching for the infant daughter taken from him during a violent inheritance war after her mother's death. Ruth had hidden the child to save her from kidnappers and blood relatives who wanted the fortune more than the baby, and by the time Omari found a trail, it had gone cold across 3 states and 100 lives. Nia shook her head because some truths are so large they first feel like cruelty. Omari stepped forward with wet eyes and held out a photograph, newer and clearer than the one inside her medallion. And there he was, exactly as she had seen him for years in faded miniature, holding her under hospital light with wonder written across his whole face. I never abandoned you, he said, voice shaking. I lost you, and I've been paying for that loss every morning since. Darius laughed once, thin and desperate, as if money were too absurd to be real unless he controlled it. Celeste tried to recover the room by saying people could claim anything with enough theatrics, but Solomon had already produced legal documents, DNA confirmation, Ruth's sealed affidavit, and letters from investigators who had traced the crest through a coastal estate archive. Omari St. Clair was not guessing, and he was not here to negotiate. He was here because the daughter stolen from his life had been found kneeling in front of a church while lesser people confused class performance for moral authority. Nia finally looked at Omari again, and what shattered her was not the wealth or the cars or the bodyguards. It was the sorrow. Men can fake charm, power, and remorse, but the grief in that man's face had lived there too long to be staged. She whispered that she did not know, and Omari reached toward her the way a starving man reaches toward water he is scared to spill. You were not supposed to know alone, he said. You were supposed to know in my arms. He held her then, right there on the church steps where she had just been ordered to kneel, and the crowd watched the entire meaning of the morning reverse. Simone slid her hand from Darius's arm as if his skin had turned hot. Silas's mouth opened, closed, then opened again with no words in it. Reverend Deborah stood with Jeremiah against her hip and looked from Nia to the bells as if suddenly hearing every sermon she had ever preached returning to judge her. The service never began the way it had been planned. Omari did not storm or shout. He simply asked whether this was the church that had watched his daughter be degraded and then saved the child with those same scraped hands. His voice was low, but it carried through the courtyard with the weight of a man used to making nations answer, and for the first time in years, Darius had no room left to perform. Inside the sanctuary, people sat down because standing felt too much like exposure. Deborah walked to the pulpit with a face stripped bare and admitted before everyone that she had let donor money silence her conscience. She said she had seen Nia's isolation, heard the whispers, watched Celeste rehearse respectability as cruelty, and still she had chosen the building over the bruised human spirit God placed right in front of her. Then she turned to Nia and apologized without trimming the ugliness, which is the only kind of apology that means anything. Darius tried to spin, he said. Nia had always kept secrets, always acted fragile, always made him carry the burden of her sadness. Celeste joined him, claiming they had only tried to help a troubled woman adjust to a better life, that everything had been misunderstood, that public scenes get distorted. But Deborah had found her courage too late to save the first wound and just in time to expose the second. She called the church treasurer forward, opened records on the lectern, and revealed that Darius and Simone's event company had been quietly paid through church contracts rooted from the building fund and padded with money Nia had signed away under coercion. The room changed again. This was no longer gossip. It was theft wrapped in hymn language, abuse protected by status, and a whole system of polished black respectability feeding itself on the silence of a woman with fewer resources and no visible family. Deborah said the church would cooperate with investigators, freeze all Bell-sponsored programs, and turn every ledger over to Solomon's legal team before sunset. It was not enough to undo what she had allowed, but it was the first honest thing she had done in a long time. Nia heard every confession with a face gone calm. The deepest wound had already been dealt on those church steps. Omari asked softly what she wanted, not what looked strong, not what pleased the crowd. Nia answered clearly, her name restored, her stolen savings returned, her marriage buried. And no other woman in that church ever taught that suffering was holiness. Deborah stepped down from the pulpit and placed the keys to the outreach wing in Nia's hand. She confessed the church had become a theater of shame and vowed to turn it into shelter. She pledged land, staff, and resources to build housing, legal aid, and counseling for women trapped in abusive marriages. Darius mocked it all until he reached for Nia's wrist from old habit. Solomon caught his arm before he touched her. In that instant, Darius realized the woman he trained to shrink now stood beyond his reach. By afternoon, divorce papers were filed, stolen accounts frozen, and investigations opened. Simone vanished. Celeste lost her social power. Darius returned to an empty house. Nia did not chase mansions. She spent quiet evenings with Omari, learning the small comfort of a father's presence. Wealth did not heal her overnight, but safety gave her space to begin. Months later, the church steps held a new gathering students, mothers, scholarship winners. Nia stood before them and said, "No woman should need riches to be treated as human." The crowd wept because truth had finally entered the building.